The sun hung low over the valley that afternoon, casting long shadows across the dusty road that led to the Henderson ranch, and Thomas Henderson stood by his fence post, watching the horizon the way he had done for more years than he cared to count. He was 58 years old now, with silver threading through his dark hair, and lines etched deep around his eyes from decades of squinting into the bright Arizona sun, and the ranch that had once buzzed with the laughter of his children and the warmth of his late wife Margaret now stood quiet except for the occasional whinny from his horses. Thomas had learned to live with the silence, though some days it pressed against him heavier than others, and today was shaping up to be one of those days when the emptiness of the old ranch house felt particularly vast. He was about to head inside when he noticed a figure moving slowly along the road, and as it drew closer he could see it was a woman, perhaps in her early 60s, wearing a faded yellow blouse and a long rust-colored skirt that kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. She walked with a peculiar gait as though carrying something heavy, though Thomas couldn't quite make out what it was, and when she reached the gate to his property, she stopped and looked up at him with eyes that held a desperate kind of hope mixed with fear. Her face was weathered by sun and hardship, but there was a gentle quality to her features, and she clutched something wrapped in burlap sacking, close to her chest like a mother cradling an infant. Thomas walked down to meet her, his boots crunching on the gravel, and as he got closer he could see that her hands were trembling. She spoke before he could offer a greeting, and her voice was soft, but urgent, carrying the weight of someone who had traveled a long way with a burden too heavy to bear alone. "Please, sir," she said, "I know this is your land and I have no right to ask, but I need help and I didn't know where else to go." Thomas removed his hat in the old-fashioned way his mother had taught him to greet a lady in distress, and he nodded for her to continue. "My name is Rose," she said. "Rose Martinez, and I've been walking since dawn and I can't walk much further." She looked down at the bundle in her arms, and Thomas noticed tears beginning to form in the corners of her eyes. "I have something here," she continued, "something precious to me. And I'm afraid of what people will think if they see, and I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't find help soon." Thomas felt his curiosity rising, but also something deeper and older and more fundamental than curiosity, and it was the instinct that had been trained into him by good parents and a good wife to help those in need without asking too many questions. "First, ma'am," he said gently, "why don't you come up to the house and we can sit in the shade and you can tell me what's troubling you?" Rose's eyes searched his face as though looking for any sign of judgment or cruelty, and whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded and followed him up the dusty path to the ranch house. Thomas led her to the covered porch, where two old rocking chairs sat facing the valley, and he brought out a pitcher of cold water and 2 glasses while Rose settled into one of the chairs, still clutching the burlap bundle. She drank deeply from the water, and Thomas could see that she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, and it was the exhaustion of worry and fear and carrying a secret that felt too heavy to hold. "Please," Rose said after a long moment, "don't look under the sack and don't judge what you can't understand right away." Thomas felt a chill run through him despite the warm afternoon air, and he wondered what could possibly be wrapped in that burlap that would require such a warning. "I promise I won't judge," he said, and he meant it because Margaret had taught him that everyone carried their own burdens and the least you could do was listen before forming opinions. Rose took a deep breath and slowly began to unwrap the burlap, and as the fabric fell away, Thomas leaned forward, and then he stopped breathing altogether. Nestled in Rose's arms, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was a baby, and not just any baby, but one with a face that told a story that Thomas recognized from his years working with the special needs program at the local church before Margaret passed. The child had the distinctive features of Down syndrome, with almond-shaped eyes and a small button nose, and the baby couldn't have been more than a few months old. Thomas felt his heart clench, not with revulsion or shock, but with a profound sadness for what he knew this woman must have endured. Rose was crying now, and the tears ran freely down her weathered cheeks, and she spoke in a rush as though afraid that if she didn't get the words out quickly, she might never say them at all. "This is my grandson," she said. "My daughter's child, and when he was born with his condition, my daughter's husband said he wouldn't raise a child like this, and he told her to give him away to an institution." She paused to catch her breath, and Thomas reached over and placed his hand gently on her arm. "My daughter," Rose continued. "She's young and she's scared, and her husband threatened to leave her if she kept the baby. And I told her I would take him, and I would raise him myself because he's innocent and he's beautiful and he deserves to be loved." Thomas felt tears forming in his own eyes now because he understood the weight of what Rose had done and the courage it took to walk away from family to save a child. "But I have no money," Rose said, "and no home anymore because I left everything to take him, and I've been staying in shelters and with kind strangers, but I can't keep doing this, and I heard in town that there was a rancher out here who once helped families in need, and I thought maybe, and I hoped." She couldn't finish the sentence because the sobs overtook her and the baby stirred in her arms, making small cooing sounds. Thomas sat back in his chair and looked out over the valley, and he thought about Margaret and how she had always said that God sent people into your life, exactly when you needed them and exactly when they needed you. He thought about his own children grown now and scattered across the country with their own lives and their own families, and how the ranch had become a place of memories rather than a place of living, and he thought about this woman who had given up everything to save a child who the world had deemed not worth saving. "Ma'am," Thomas said finally, "I think you should stay here for a while and catch your breath and rest and let me think about how we can help you and this little one." Rose looked at him with such hope and gratitude that Thomas felt his heart break and mend all at once. "But first," he said, "I'd like to hold him if that's all right with you." Rose nodded and carefully transferred the baby into Thomas's arms, and as he looked down at the small face with its bright eyes and peaceful expression, he felt something shift inside him. The baby looked up at him and smiled, and a tiny hand reached up and grasped Thomas's finger with surprising strength. "What's his name?" Thomas asked. "Samuel," Rose said. "I named him Samuel after my father, who was the kindest man I ever knew." "Samuel," Thomas repeated, and he found himself smiling for the first time in months. That evening, as the sun set over the valley, Thomas set up one of the old bedrooms for Rose and made a makeshift crib for Samuel from a drawer lined with soft blankets. He cooked dinner and simple meal of beans and cornbread, and they ate together on the porch while Samuel slept peacefully nearby. Rose told him more of her story and how she had worked as a seamstress for 40 years, and how her daughter Maria was only 23 and frightened of losing her husband. "She calls me sometimes," Rose said quietly, "and she cries and asks if Samuel is all right, and I tell her he's perfect, and he is." Thomas listened and nodded and didn't offer easy answers because he knew there weren't any. The days turned into weeks, and Rose and Samuel remained at the ranch, and Thomas found himself looking forward to mornings again because there was life in the house and there was purpose. Rose helped with cooking and mending and keeping the house in order, and she had a gentle way about her that reminded Thomas of Margaret. Samuel grew and thrived, and he laughed when Thomas played peekaboo with him, and he watched the horses with wide, fascinated eyes. Thomas taught Rose how to care for the chickens, and together they worked in the garden that Margaret had planted years ago, and that Thomas had let go wild. The neighboring ranchers heard about Rose and Samuel, and some came by with donations of baby clothes and formula, and others came just to meet the child, old Mrs. Patterson from the church brought over casseroles and told Rose about the support groups in town for families with special needs. Children. Doc Reynolds, the retired veterinarian who still kept an eye on Thomas's horses, stopped by and examined Samuel without being asked and declared him healthy and strong. "This boy's going to do just fine," Doc said, "especially with people like you two looking after him." One evening, about 2 months after Rose had arrived, Thomas sat on the porch with his old friend Frank Morrison, who owned the neighboring property. "You know people are talking," Frank said, but there was no judgment in his voice. Only curiosity. "Let them talk," Thomas said, and he surprised himself with how little he cared. "They're saying, 'You're doing a good thing,'" Frank continued, "and they're right, and Margaret would be proud." Thomas felt the familiar ache of missing his wife, but it was gentler now, and mixed with something else, and something like gratitude. That night after Rose had put Samuel to bed, she came out to the porch where Thomas sat watching the stars. "I need to tell you something," she said, and there was nervousness in her voice. Thomas braced himself, thinking she was going to say she needed to leave.